Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. This episode will be another part to Ancestor Search, where it takes us over here to Chicago, Illinois, to the Confederate Mound. It says the final resting place of up to 6,000 Confederate soldiers, the largest mass grave in the Western Hemisphere. This is on Atlas Obscura, and as you can see right here, it has a replica platform mound, and then the monument that is also replica of American Indian culture. But we'll go down in the article and read, and then I'll point out the interesting facts. It says on the south side of Chicago, thousands of Confederate soldiers are buried in a single mass grave. Oakwood Cemetery is home to the Confederate Mound, said to be the largest mass grave in the entire Western Hemisphere. The Southern Civil War soldiers found their way to this resting place via Camp Douglas, a training ground turned overcrowded prisoner of war camp. Set on land not far from Lake Michigan, soldiers were subjected to severe cold and wind that tore through their hastily built barracks. They were also subjected to mistreatment by the cruel and inexperienced guards employed to keep the citizens of Chicago safe. Most of the soldiers died from diseases as scurvy, dysentery, and smallpox in the camp, but some were shot as punishment. Camp Douglas lived up to its nickname, 80 Acres of Hell. The bodies were originally buried in Chicago City Cemetery near the Camp Douglas Hospital, but the graveyard was closed due to flooding. The Confederate coffins were relocated to Oakwood Cemetery in 1866 in concentric trenches that circled the plot. So here you have the Confederate Mound, and they were reinterred at a place called Oak Mound Cemetery in 1866 in a trench that circled the plot. So here you got another circle formation. Goes on to say that the site was unremarkable until 1893 when a 30-foot tall monument was erected atop the grave. It is topped with a sober soldier, and on the sides it lists the names of 4,200 soldiers buried in the grave. 12 individual grave markers commemorate unidentified Union soldiers who died while stationed at Camp Douglas. The rest of the thousands buried in the grave go unknown. Pause. So it says that there are 4,200 names on the side of that monument that came in almost 30 years later after we're buried there. But it also says that the rest of the thousands buried in the grave go unknown. So you see how it conflicts right there inside of the writing. It says it isn't even known exactly how many there are, but estimates suggest up to 6,000 are buried here. A pyramid of cannonballs and a cannon also decorate the site, reminding visitors of the war that led to these men's deaths. Now, we can go back and point out the fact that it says that the bodies were originally buried in Chicago City Cemetery near the Camp Douglas Hospital, but the graveyard was closed due to flooding. In previous videos, we talked about, and it showed how flooding caused bodies to be dug up and reinterred at different locations. So here it is again, reoccurring in 1866 in Chicago. Now, when you go look at the history of Chicago or Illinois, it says that Illinois became a state in 1818. Then when you go look at the list of Indian massacres, the first time Illinois pops up on the list is in 1812. It says during the War of 1812, Indians allied with the British killed American soldiers and settlers. It says those were United States troops and Powhatan Native Americans that occurred on August 15th, 1812. Then in the same year, it says 24 settlers, including 15 children, were massacred by a war party of Native Americans, mostly Shawnee, but possibly including Lenape and Powhatamis. Then way down here in 1832, after Illinois had been a state for about 14 years, you had Indian Creek Massacre, a party of Powhatamis with a few Sioux Indians, killed 15 men, women, and children, kidnapped 2 young women who were later ransomed, and that was in Illinois. And those are the only times Illinois comes up on the Indian massacres list. The last one being in 1832, 2 years after the Indian Removal Act. Then when you go look at the American Civil War battles site list, you see that Illinois and Chicago being way up here in Cook County off this water right here is way far away from a lot of these so-called Civil War battles, indicating that they would not have taken a bunch of so-called prisoners of war way up here to house them or imprison them. Now, when you go looking around at the place, the Confederate Mound, you'll see that the area was actually a mound village. When you go look at a tribes map of Indiana and then Illinois, you see that basically the Miami tribe were located right there around Chicago. And the Miami were also part of the Illini tribe as well. So they all kind of congealed together right there. It says that most of the tribes in the Illini Confederation in Miami spoke Miami, Illinois languages, and at the Grand Village, there was roughly a population of 20,000 people in the 17th century. So by the 1800s, those numbers would have probably quadrupled. It says they occupied a broad inverted triangle from modern day Iowa to the near shores of Lake Michigan in modern Chicago south to Arkansas. So the Miami people were in Chicago and they show up on the massacres list in 1781 when it says that 32 settlers killed by 50 Miami people while trying to move to safety. And in total, 64 settlers were killed, because it says additionally approximately 15 settlers and 17 soldiers were killed attempting to bury the initial victims. And that was in Kentucky. Then they also showed up in 1791 at present-day Fort Recovery, Ohio. An army of 1,500 Americans led by Arthur St. Clair was ambushed by an army of Miami Indians led by Chief Little Turtle. So the Miami Indians were very vicious, and that's who I suspect these so-called soldiers are right here on the south side of Chicago at the Confederate Mound, where they are buried in concentric trenches that circle the plot. But presumably, if not all of these, definitely the rest of the thousands buried in the grave go unknown. Definitely those. But on a side note, when you go look at the Indians massacres list, you can see how things went from basically the French and Indian War to the Revolutionary War to the War of 1812, the Creek War, Seminole Wars, and then it goes right over to to some more Seminole War right there in Florida in 1840. But then it's all Texas, California, New Mexico, Washington, Utah, Arizona, Oregon, Nebraska, California, Oklahoma. It does not show any massacres in the South, Southeast, or East Coast from basically the 1840s. Then, when you take all of that into account and look at this map right here, you'll see that the French and Indian War, they were fighting up here, Indians and settlers. Right here on the massacres list from 1755, it says Pennsylvania, New York. There was a thing in Texas, but Quebec is up there, Ohio, West Virginia, New York again, Pennsylvania, okay, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. Then we getting over into the Revolutionary War, where it's up in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, Kentucky, but it says 17 Dutch settlers killed and 2 taken captive and scalped by the Indians in Kentucky. So New York. So in those wars, French and Indian War, and then the Revolutionary War, a lot of this became controlled by Europeans. Then over here, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, a lot of this stuff became European controlled during the War of 1812. As you look at the list, go down, War of 1812, you get into Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and then it don't show a lot of the stuff. And the reason why I don't show is because of stuff probably like this right here, where it says the rest of the thousands buried in the grave go unknown. It's a reoccurrence when I go through all of these and I see that certain areas with a lot of mass graves have very little information about them, or they don't show up on the massacres list and other things like they should. So one of the things I want to point out to get you a better understanding of what I'm trying to say is that in all these wars, starting with the French and Indian War, going into the Revolutionary War, and then the War of 1812, it shows all these different Indians allied with different Europeans. the French, the British, and it shows the massacres during the so-called different wars they were having. But when it comes to the Civil War, when I showed in a previous video a list of the numerous different American Indian tribes and confederations that were involved in the Civil War, none of that comes up. The Civil War and those different massacres that were going on between the Indians and the U.S. troops does not come up. So that further lets you know. For an example, right here during the Revolutionary War in New York, says British and Seneca forces attacked the fort and village of Cherry Valley, New York, killing 16 rebel troops and more than 30 settlers. Or right here in 1813, during the War of 1812 in Kentucky, where it says during the War of 1812, Indians allied with the British killed between 30 and 60 Kentucky militia. So Indians allied with the British. Then down here in 1861, during the California Indian Wars, at Horse Canyon Massacre, says white settlers and Indian allies attacked a Waukee village in Horse Canyon, killing up to 240 Waukes. There is, however, one entry concerning the U.S. Civil War on this massacres list in 1862 in Oklahoma, the Tonkawa Massacre. Now, before I read that, we got to know that the Tonkawa are actually from Houston, Texas. As you can see right here, where it says Tonkawa, right up against the Caddo, okay? But it says during the U.S. Civil War, a detachment of irregular Union Indians, mainly Kickapoo, Lenape, and Shawnee, accompanied by Caddo allies, attempted to destroy the Tonkawa tribe in Indian Territory. Pause. The Caddo never were irregular Union Indian soldiers. Ever. Never. Right here at nps.gov, it says that Little Boy, he was chief of the Caddo people in the mid to late 1800s. During the Civil War, he led an all-American Indian battalion for the Confederacy. So we caught him in a lie right there. Two more lies and I'll leave it alone. The next one is they didn't look like this. The next one, and a very critical one, it says that during the Civil War, most of the Caddo groups abandoned the Indian Territory and resettled in southern and eastern Kansas. Now, when you look at a map of Kansas tribes, you see that the Osage were all of basically East Kansas. And the Osage fought the Caddo, pushing them out of some former territory and became dominant in the region of present-day Missouri, Arkansas, and eastern Kansas. Right there it says that, and then it says Osage Indians, and when the Osage had driven the Caddo tribes out of the area by 1805. So the Caddo and the Osage had beef. They had warring with each other. So when it says that the Caddo groups abandoned the Indian Territory and resettled in southern and eastern Kansas, but they moved back to the Wichita Reservation in 1867. Trust me, when they came back, they looked like this. And that's how it went pretty much across the board. The true Indians were driven out and then some imposters were replaced. And I'll speak to that for a second. Let's look at what they tell us the Osage look like. Right here is a group of so-called Osage Indians right here. These people. It's supposed to be Osage warriors right here. But as you can see, they're polar Asians. These are Eskimos. Now, right here at the library.org, it says for a description of the savage Osages, as they were sometimes called, let us examine the reports of the earlier explorers who observed them in their native state before European influences. Morse reported them to be of remarkable height, not many being less than 6 feet high, and of fine figure. Some would have been perfect models for a sculpture. They are in appearance, says Jones, as noble a race of people as I have ever seen. Well-formed, athletic, and robust men of noble aspect, were the words of Audubon. The Osages, says Bradbury, are so tall and robust as to almost warrant the application of the term gigantic. Few of them appear to be under 6 feet, and many are above it. Their soldiers and vices are broad and which tend to strengthen the idea of there being giants. The ability and agility of the Osages is scarcely credible, says Nuttall. Instances of deformity were rare among them. Now, none of these people look over 6 feet tall. Osage Indians, it says, genealogy, family search. These are polar Asians. See the faces? See the eyes? Polar Asians. Through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?